Hello, everybody. We're back for our weekly chat with author Kevin McAleer. We've covered some of the life and works of not only of his own works, but of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Jack London. And we're now on a series of discussions of Raymond Chandler. We had a general discussion 2 videos ago. Our last video was of his first novel, The Big Sleep. And this is our second week of doing the novels, and this one is Farewell, My Lovely, which I think Kevin says is his favorite. Is that correct, Kevin?
Up until now, that could change with the rereading of a couple others.
And
But
it
up
was,
until now,
and I've read that it also was Raymond Chandler's favorite novel, and I guess a lot of critics would agree that it's his favorite novel. Is that not correct?
yeah. Why don't we start there?
Okay.
Uh, why don't we start there? Uh, why should it perhaps be Chandler aficionado's favorite novel in large part? Maybe you can tell me. You read it for the first time. I've read it for like the fifth or sixth now. So I have very firm ideas about it. But what would be interesting is you telling me what you think of it.
Uh, yeah, I liked it.
And excuse me, and maybe in comparison to The Big Sleep. Those are the two you've read thus far, and those are actually arguably his two most famous.
Yeah, well, I what did I liked it a lot. Um, I think I may have liked it better than The Big Sleep. Uh, I like the characterizations. The Malloy character is a good ambiguous villain. Uh, and then you have the elderly lady who lives in the house that Marlowe visits. What's the older lady's last name who owns
Uh,
the club?
it's Mrs. Florian. Mrs. Florian.
The Florian character is nice, and so is the character who he meets upon the murder of this gentleman who took him to get some jewels back, apparently.
Right.
He's an interesting character, and so is the woman he meets at the scene of the crime. I forget all the names because I
And Anne Reardon is the name of the young lady. Yeah.
and Reardon's a good one. You know, I'm reading The High Window. I'm almost done with The High Window. So again, some of the little characters and plot lines are uh,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
sometimes confusing to me, but I can say that the characterizations were good. Uh, there the plot line was somewhat easy to follow, although I didn't completely get it.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, on my fifth read.
Okay, you're reading it the fifth time. What's your thoughts on the fifth time?
Well, yeah, we'll get to a little bit of the plot here in a second, folks, because I think the plot is a bit more easy to follow than The Big Sleep. And that's my impression, my fifth reading. And you're nodding your head. You would agree a bit.
I would think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that one chapter really leads to the next, whereas, and it like flows into it. Whereas with the big piece, it's like, okay, set piece here in the greenhouse, set piece here in the, in Geiger's Den of Iniquity. Okay, set piece here in Joe Brody's apartment. You know what I mean? Whereas this is like one clue is really leading to the next, it seems to me, at least in the mind of Marlowe. We're not always able to follow his machinations. He's keeping stuff from us because then he springs it on us at the end, a couple things that we really weren't clear on, which is kind of cheating. Chandler would argue too, but again, he had the problem of cannibalizing. In this case, he did 3 separate short stories he'd published earlier. The Big Sleep was 2.
Oh, I have one more thing I really liked about it, if I may interrupt.
Go.
Okay. I really like that plot twist at the end that Mrs. Grail is actually Velma. And
Yeah.
that
Right.
was a stunner.
Yeah, I never caught on to that in my initial readings, or my initial reading. Right, if you read to the end, you find out that's the case. Right, but in my initial reading, that did surprise me as well, and that's where I think a certain little bit of information was being kept from us. Uh, why? Now, let's start telling people what this is about. I'm going to do my best to try and get us into the plot just to a small degree, and then
Yeah,
we'll get back to Mrs. Grail. Interesting name, huh? A la Parsifal, the
I was
Grail.
thinking the thing. I was thinking the same.
Grayle. Now, she's not your damsel in distress necessarily. She's more of a femme fatale. In fact, she's almost the definition of the film noir femme fatale.
There you go.
Really, very sexy, kills her share of men, lures them into her web, and blows them away.
And you know what? We first meet Miss Grail at the Purisima Canyon. Purisima means pure, so we have the pure night of the Grail.
Uh-huh. We meet her unbeknownst to ourselves, though. Again, we're getting
That's
to
true.
getting ahead of ourselves. Yeah, this is very confusing for anyone who has not read it. Actually, I'm thinking that these videos are mainly for people who might have read it, who might have read Chandler, because again, to sum up the plot is almost impossible. But I'm going to make it a stab at getting us into.
Kevin, I don't. Let me just say before you continue, I don't care at all if we don't cover it in a linear fashion, because as you said early on, it's tough to really say the plot sequence
Yes.
to sequence.
Right. But what I want to get our listeners to comprehend is why you should then say, I had no idea that Velma Valento was Mrs. Grail. We got to get them into that.
Okay, go ahead and
cover that. The story starts with Marlowe on a case. It's sort of a dead-end case, and then he meets on the street Central Avenue, which was in the 30s in Los Angeles, was mainly black. And he sees this big, giant white guy there. He's dressed in an outrageous fashion. And that's where you have that famous simile of he looked about as inconspicuous as a tarantula on a slice of angel food. And then the similes just go on and on from there. I mean, you probably noted that. It just almost every page, and I can understand why our mother got a little bit distracted and annoyed by them. If you're a fan, then you just want more of them, of course, and I am. But that's how he's described. And then he's looking up at this sign. It says Florian's, neon sign. It's daytime, but it's a neon sign, Florian's, with a dreamy look on his face. And he goes up there. He goes up to this club. It's a club, second story. And on the way up, he throws this attendant, this Negro attendant. Negroes is what they were calling them. So, if I slip into that. He throws this Negro attendant out onto the street. This guy, he's about 265 pounds, 6'6", all muscle, and an ex-con, as it turns out. And then Marlowe's curious at this point, and he goes in. And this guy kind of gives him a helping hand. Get in here, And he goes, come up here with me to the bar. Just like that. So Marlowe's in it all of a sudden, where he's in on a story that he had no business from the very beginning being involved with.
Right.
It's just his curiosity and serendipity that he gets involved in it, which is an interesting ploy because usually, and that's the case with The Big Sleep, usually in the classic Marlowe, at least as we imagine the classic Marlowe stories and the classic detective stories, Sam Spade, all the rest, Sherlock Holmes, a client comes to them with a problem, and then they say, okay, good, we'll see what we can do. No. Marlowe is involved in this from the beginning. What happens is this guy, this big guy, his name's Moose Malloy, love the name, and he goes up to this bar, and he's looking for this girl called Velma. He's going, have you seen Velma? He's looking for Velma. Who knows what the relationship between them was? Maybe he was the bouncer there. She was a showgirl or a singer of some sort. Anyway, this was many years ago because in the meantime, he has been serving time for a bank holdup. And apparently he did it single-handed. If any guy could do it, it would be him, right? And he got he got convicted, and he was in prison for about 8 years, I think it was. And now he's coming back to see his sweetheart, and because he doesn't know where she is. Right? She broke off contact with him at a certain point. He's still in love with her, and he goes up to the place that he last saw her at, which is this club called Florian's. Well, it's a black club, right? It's no more. It's none of the same ownership as before. It was mainly a white club back then. And he, the bouncer. Chandler does a great job of describing this confrontation. It really is beautiful. This black bouncer takes a shot at him. The guy kind of shakes it off and throws the guy against the wall. To make a long story short, there's no Velma there. Moose Malloy ends up killing the owner, the black owner, who pulls a gun on him because he feels threatened, as one might imagine, by this guy just barging in. And then he's on the run. So he's killed a man, and he's looking for Velma, and that's all we know. And that's all Marlowe really knows. And then the cops come, and he gets involved with a guy named McNulty, who's kind of he's kind of a dead on his feet cop, kind of a loser cop. And he asks Marlowe, well, they always give me the these Negro murders. They always, and that's kind of a denigrating way of saying, no one cares. No one cares if a Negro gets killed in this town, right? So they give me them. Right. They give me them, I'm not going to get any publicity. I won't even get a mention in the want ads, I think was the line. And he said, can you give me a hand on this? It's just you're involved in this. You seem interested. And Marlowe said, well, yeah, actually I am kind of, and I don't have any work right now. So yeah, I think I'll go out as a freelance, again, our knight errant, he's freelancing, and he starts to investigate this thing about Velma. He's curious about who is this Velma that this Moose Malloy, spent 8 years in prison thinking about, apparently, and then he ends up killing a man searching for her, and all he has on his mind apparently is this Velma. Now, this is what Marlowe has on his mind for the next 5-6 days, is the space of the action in the novel. Who is this Velma, right? And so that's Tim's mention of that. It's a surprise at the end to find out that Velma is actually a wealthy socialite that Marlowe comes into contact periodically throughout the novel, and we're none the wiser. We don't know that they are the same person. Now we think, let me just say this. This is actually an important point. So I've given you enough of the plot, because if we go on from here, it'll take forever. I'll be saying this for the next 4 or 5 videos, Tim. It's just, you agree. But we're in the plot at this point. Marlowe is curious about this Velma, and it leads him into a tangled skein of intrigue and murder and betrayal and blackmail and all kinds of stuff, right? But that's the start. And the bottom line is, when we finally get to the end of the novel, there is this revelation that Velma, this showgirl in this cheap joint, and she's just disappeared, and her ex-boyfriend is coming back to look for her. She's just disappeared. Well, she is right under our nose the whole time. She's hiding in plain sight. She's the purloined letter. She is meeting with almost every one of the main characters, with the chief of police or his deputy. I don't know who's Randall anyway. And then telephoning with various characters. She meets up with Ann Reardon, who's a girl who is the daughter of an ex-chief of police of Bay City, the alias for Santa Monica in this book, Bay City. And he was railroaded out of office because of the corruption of the city. And there's all sorts of characters involved. Not to mention Marriott, who's the first one to get killed. And it's a long string of corpses, just like a Shakespeare tragedy. And pardon me?
Lindsay Marriott, you're talking
Lindsay
about?
Marriott, right. And so, and this woman, Mrs. Grail, I got it right here, her full, she's married a fellow named Mr. Lewin Lockridge Grail, who's a man much older than her, and in his 60s, she's maybe 30, early 30s. And she's a very attractive woman, catnip for the men. And she's got $20 million behind her, which was a lot of money back in 1940. And she's in contact with all these various characters we've mentioned, and then some. Okay, so she's hiding in plain sight. We don't know this. Okay, several of the characters do know this, and that makes for the drama, because this ex-showgirl, this ex-Velma Valento, that Moose Malloy has been, pining for all these years, is now looking for, and willing to go over dead bodies for. She is in fact now married to this old millionaire named Mr. Lewin Lockridge Grail. So she goes by the name of Mrs. Lewin Lockridge Grail, but this is the ex Velma Valento. And the whole idea is that's the whole plot, actually. It's to find out who is Velma and where is she. And much to your surprise, when you come to the end, it's Mrs. Lewin Lockridge Grail, right? And why I think that's why I, on my fifth or sixth, whatever reading of it, was a bit miffed by the whole mystery, is because I think it has a rather hollow center to it. Why do I say that? Well, it turns out, folks, that Velma Valento, now Mrs. Lewin Lockridge Grail, has been resorting to all kinds of underhanded means, and even murder. The first murder, she turns out to be the murderess that Tim mentioned, that we meet in Parissima Canyon. She murders this fellow.
That would be Kevin. That's the second murder.
It's the first murder at her hands, however.
Okay, there we go.
What I'm referring to, yes.
Okay.
And we meet her there for the first time without knowing it's her, because Mary just turns up dead, and Marlowe discovers him, and
we don't meet her, Kevin. We don't meet her in Parissima Canyon.
We don't. No, I of course I made that very. I'm trying to make that clear. No, we meet her in absentia. This Lindsay Marriott, basically because he knows too much. He knows that she was a showgirl. We're getting to my point. He knows that she was a showgirl, and he has a trust deed on a house of Mrs. Florian, who's the widow of Mike Florian, who used to own this Florian's, where Velma Valento worked. And so they're all kind of involved with each other. And the idea is that Velma, now Mrs. Lewin Lockridge Grail, doesn't want people to know her past. Now, this is where I see the weak link. It's like, why would you resort to murder and all kinds of underhanded tactics? And eventually she kills two more people by the end of the novel, and is willing to kill a fourth, namely our hero, Philip Marlowe. She takes a shot at him, but she doesn't have a bullet in the pistol. And who knows how many others she's sent to an early grave, because she wants to cover up her past. She doesn't want people to know she was a cheap showgirl in a cheap joint called Florian's. I don't understand that would motivate someone to take such drastic measures. And that's where I say nix to this plot. That's where I finally bored into it. I thought, I don't see that. Now I can maybe understand how she would want to cover her tracks so Moose wouldn't be able to track her down, right?
Correct.
This is a violent man. He has a violent passion. I could understand that. Okay, so it's the plot for me isn't completely ruined, but there were these other aspects that Chandler was playing up about how she didn't want people to know her past. I thought, well, this really must be the 1930s, 1940 when the book was published, because who cares? In America these days, it's like, yay, you made your way up from a showgirl to marry a rich millionaire. Good on you, girl. Like, we would applaud, right? And they would be proud of it, and you do a reality television show on them. So that's where I kind of wobbled in suspending my disbelief about the whole plot, and there I'm done.
You alluded to it already, but I felt that it seemed kind of legitimate for her to be so concerned to cover her past, because she apparently was the one who turned in Moose Malloy concerning the bank heist, and she would be in big trouble with him, boy, if he were to find out who she is.
Good.
It seems somewhat believable on that angle.
Yes. Good point, Tim. I should have mentioned that. What I had that in mind when I was talking about the Moose Malloy angle is plausible for me, right? But I should have mentioned that to add even greater plausibility for our listeners. Yes, exactly. So it holds up. The plot holds up from that end. But there's this other aspect of it of trying to not be heard on the radio by Mrs. Florian. Mrs. Florian will blow her cover. What's Mrs. Florian going to do? The Moose is in jail because she's like doing all these machinations about 5 years back, right? Yeah. I don't see it. But the Moose Malloy angle, good. The plot is sustained thereby. She doesn't want him. He's violent. He might kill her, might kill her husband, might do something drastic or violent, and that could ruin reputation if it doesn't kill her. Right. Got it.
Okay, and that brings me to the next question. What is her motive for killing Lindsay? Apparently, Lindsay was supposed to knock off Marlowe, and he didn't do it, so she killed him instead. That's a little confusing right there. Do you have any insight on the Marriott killing?
I was going to ask you the same question. I'm not sure. Yeah, that's tricky. I think, try this one.
Okay.
I think the way Marlowe explains it is that what happens is that Marlowe does do a very good job of trying to track down Velma Valento. And he eventually does end up at this Jessie Florian's house, who is the widow of Mike Florian, who had owned Florian's, where Velma worked. And he asks her about him. And he asked her about her. She asked Jessie about Velma. And I think that's a great scene. I mean, at a certain point, we got to stop with the plot because we got to start talking about the scenes. That's what Chandler was most interested in, actually, of course. The scenes, the characters, the atmosphere. And that's one of the greatest scenes I've read of him, where he goes in, and these were the days, this is something you may not understand, not you, but people may not understand. He's plying people with bonded bourbon. He goes out and buys, I guess, a flask, kind of one of these flat, pints of bourbon, sticks it in his jacket, and goes out. First, he goes to a hotel, kitty corner from Florian's, and it's a Negro hotel on Central Avenue again, I think. And he plies the attendant with a couple glasses of good bonded bourbon, and the guy outs with some information. It's like people are apparently very willing for a couple drinks to give out with information that you ordinarily wouldn't. But you have to remember, I think, that this is the Depression. Before the war started, the Depression was full on. It was going full on until the war started and the military production kicked off and people are getting jobs and all the rest. So, and good booze for poor people was perhaps not that easily to come by. So he goes to this Mrs. Florian because he gets the tip from this hotel owner, this hotel attendant, the guy at the reception, and he finds her house, and it's a rundown place, and she's run down. She's an alcoholic. So this is a good ploy for a woman who's a lush. He makes his way into her house, and he starts plying her with this bourbon, and she starts coming across with some information. And he learns indeed that this certain Velma did work at Florian's over a certain amount of time. But then this Jessie, she says, but my husband's dead and Velma's dead too. Okay. Well, at a certain point, she goes into a room in her house, and she goes into a trunk, and she is going through all kinds of pictures and stuff. And Marlowe sneaks up behind her. He's good at doing this. He's a real detective. He's a real gumshoe. He does a lot of sneaking. Yeah. And you often catch him as he leaves a room. He'll leave the room, and then he'll like shut the door, and then he'll open it again quietly and look through. He's doing that all the time. He does that with Florian before he leaves, with Jesse Florian, in fact. And then so she brings out these pictures. Yes, these are pictures of the people who used to work there. But before she does that, before she gets those pictures and comes out when he takes his place back in the living room, he sees her taking a photo out and looking at it and slipping it down in the side of the trunk. He makes note of that. And so when she comes out with the other photos, he's kind of looking through them, a bunch of showbiz types, cheap vaudeville circuit performers. He says, "Hey, give me another drink." And as he's doing that, he rushes into the room and goes in the trunk and goes and gets the picture. And it says, it's a shot, black and white, of a showgirl type. And it says, "Ever yours, Velma Valento," right? So this is apparently Velma Valento. So he's apparently got a picture of her, right? And he goes in and he says, "What's this, Miss Jessie Florian?" And she says, she's dead. She's dead. Yeah. Marlowe, by the way, he's saying, well, she asks, she's not stupid. She's not entirely stupid. And she asks him, "Why are you looking for her?" She wants to know. He says, "Oh, her parents are looking for her. And there's a little bit of money involved. And, I'm trying to trace her down." I said, "Well, it's kind of been a long time to be looking for her after all these years, huh?" He's like, "Well, a little money involved makes up a story." Anyway, she swears that this Velma Valento is dead. Okay, well, he takes the photo, sticks it in his pocket, and then it just goes on and on and on from here. I guess I didn't quite get to your question, because as it turns out, then this Lindsay Marriott, the first person to get second person to get killed in the novel, but first person to get killed by Velma Valento, he has a trust deed on this house where Mrs. Florian lives, for whatever reason. We don't know yet. But we find that out soon enough through Marlowe, who has a hunch, right? And he calls around and calls the Hall of Records or whatever. And so what apparently happened is that this Miss Florian, she went right to this Lindsay Marriott, who has the trust deed on her house. A trust deed is basically a mortgage. You can foreclose on it at any point. It means you have control over this person in the house. You can evict them if they want. So you got power over them. And she goes and she tells about this Marlowe character, and she gives Marriott Marlowe's card. And this then leads, apparently, we're learning some of this only after Marlowe's summation at the end. He apparently then gets in touch with Velma Valento, now Mrs. Lewin Lockridge Grayle, and tells her about this Marlowe who's looking for, Velma Valento. Okay, so all of a sudden, Miss Lewin Lockridge Grayle, who is Miss Velma Valento, she is getting a little bit worried. And what she decides then is not to kill Marlowe necessarily, who might be the logical choice, but she decides to kill Lindsay Marriott. And the way she sets it up is she says, Lindsay, tell him that we got some jade jewelry stolen. We were out in the town and the gang held us up. It was a heist, and now they want to sell it back to us for like $8,000, and they want to meet us at a certain place in Parissima Canyon. And you just call them and say you want a little company, you're a little bit scared, and then we'll do him in. I guess that was the conversation, more or less. But as it so happens, Marlowe is not done in. He's blackjacked, so he's, for the first time, he's knocked unconscious. But the one who gets killed is Lindsay Marriott, and it turns out by this Velma Valento, because he's the weak link, apparently. He's the one who knows everything about her from the get-go, and used to work with her at a radio station where she used to be a singer, and the radio station was owned by her present millionaire husband, Mr. Lewin Lockridge Grayle. But apparently she thinks that Lindsay Marriott, not Marlowe, is the real threat, that Marlowe will just sort of lose, he'll lose the scent, which he almost does several times, but he always picks it up. So
I find that we might do this for the next 5 videos on the next 5 novels, because I find it's intriguing to explore the Chandler novels via the characters rather
yes,
than just doing, okay, let's go through the plot from beginning to end. That can get a little bit tedious and difficult and
yes,
convoluted. Whereas if you
indeed,
if you examine it from the character's point of view, you got all these different connections that start to coalesce and create the novel. So for example, you've mentioned a bit about the characters of Moose Malloy, Mrs. Florian, uh, Lockridge, Mrs. Lockridge Grail, Marlowe himself. What two other intriguing characters that I'd like you to extrapolate on, if you'd be so kind, are Dr. Sonderberg and the Swami. What's the name of the Swami guy?
Jules Amthor.
Jules. And what about those two? Those two come in the second half of the novel, and they're very fascinating characters as well, and a bit exotic in the case of Jules.
Yeah. We'll get him in a second. I think the Sonderborg character, and you'll see this particularly in The Long Goodbye, but I think it crops up in almost every one of the Marlowe novels. There's always some seedy, kind of on the take, sort of backstreet doctor. And Chandler has got his claws out for these guys. Apparently, he must have been traumatized, because in almost every novel there's one of these types, or two or three, as in The Long Goodbye. Yeah, this Sonderberg guy. This is interesting. This is where Marlowe ends up for a couple days after he gets blackjacked for the second time by some cops, right? Who come to escort him from, yes, the hilltop, not hideout, but outpost, shall we say, of our psychic Jules Amthor. And I'm getting a little bit out of order here, but back to Sonderberg. He ends up in this, it's sort of like a private hospital, sort of like a sanatorium, and this Sonderberg guy runs it, and he keeps Marlowe hopped up with whatever drug. Who knows what they're doing, but Marlowe talks about having all kinds of puncture wounds in his arm, and he's been brought there by the cops, these two cops who blackjacked him and brought him away from Amthor. So they're all involved with the Bay City police, because these Bay City cops, they go over the line to this Jules Amthor's place, which is not in Santa Monica, Bay City. It's in Los Angeles, outside the precinct. So they go outside the precinct, and they take Marlowe away, and they blackjack him, and then they take him into the Sonderberg character. It shows just the corruption that Marlowe is ascribing to Santa Monica. It's very clear. He's talking about Santa Monica the whole time here, and the LA cops, in the persons of Lieutenant Randall and even Nolte, who's, he's inept, but he's honest, it seems, right? And Marlowe comes down really hard on Santa Monica, my birthplace, my the home of my birth. We knew Los Angeles was very corrupt at the time. We talked about that in one of the episodes, but I wasn't clear on how corrupt Santa Monica apparently was. Let's say it was. He says so. Probably knew what he was talking about. So that's Dr. Sonderberg. And then Jules Amthor, whence Marlowe comes to Sonderberg, escorted by the two cops, is this psychic whose trail he gets on because in a cigarette case of Lindsay Marriott, there are marijuana cigarettes, and their mouthpieces turn out to be rolled up business cards from this certain Jules Amthor. And through the auspices of this Anne Reardon, who happens upon the murder site and befriends Marlowe. She indicates to Marlowe that there might be a clue here, and in his office, he's fooling around with him, and he cuts open one of the mouthpieces and discovers this business card of Jules Amthor, a psychic, and he's wondering what is going on here, and leads him to Jules Amthor, who then, with the help of a giant Indian, basically beats him up. The Indian chokes him just a split second away from unconsciousness, and then Amthor takes Marlowe's own gun and is pistol whipping him across the jaw. And this is arguably the third time, well, the third time will come, but the second time that Marlowe is basically beaten to a pulp to the point where he's unconscious. He kind of lays his head down on the table after all that. So he's taking a beating, this poor boy. So I didn't so much talk about the characters, I suppose. I'm getting back more into the plot, but all these sort of, liminal, unconventional, living off the dregs of society kinds of types is what, and the dregs of society themselves. That's what interests Chandler, it seems. And the one character I found to be the most interesting, for my money, is Laird Brunette, and he's sort of the hooligan, the mobster, the gangster, whatever you want to call him. But the guy who paid $30,000, again, when $30,000 was real money, to help the present mayor of Bay City become mayor. And he's got a lot of people on the take, apparently. The police chief, we have a little tete-a-tete between Marlowe and John Wax. That's an interesting one. Or they're drinking in the office. I guess they did that back then. Have a snort or two. And Wax basically, and Marlowe makes it clear to Wax that he's got some big money behind him, because in the meantime, he's working also for Mrs. Lewin Lockridge Grayle, and she has that 20 mil of her husband behind him at this point. And then John Wax, who was a little bit resistant, obviously goes, "Oh, so well that's a whole different story." He's a good friend of the department, and we'll help you out here. But I find Laird Brunette the most interesting one, because almost every character here is beset by corruption in one form or another. There are just a couple exceptions.
Kevin.
And Moose Malloy would be one of them. Marlowe really likes Moose Malloy. That's very clear. And you wanted to interrupt me because I was going on for too long.
Oh, no. You were doing great. It's really good to hear you extrapolate on these things so spontaneously and with clarity. Laird Brunette reminded me of Jay Gatsby.
A little bit, yeah.
Kind of this mysterious guy behind the scenes with his own charisma, and we're building up to this guy and finding out what he's all about. And he's got these possible mob connections and whatnot. So there was a Gatsby feel to him for me.
Yeah, and he's running one of these gambling ships out beyond the 3-mile limit off the coast of Santa Monica. And Marlowe makes his way out there at some point because he feels that this might be where Moose Malloy is hiding out. How he got that hunch, we don't know. But anyway, he wants to get a message to Moose Malloy. We don't know what that message is, but he thinks that because of Laird Brunette and how he's got his fingers in all kinds of pies and he's got all kinds of connections, that in whatever fashion, he will be able to maybe get a message out to Moose Malloy. And what that, and you're right, there is kind of a Gatsby, there's kind of an attractive quality to him. He might be a mobster, but he's he's an honest mobster, by mobster standards. I mean, he's a gentleman, it seems. He's well spoken. He treats Marlowe with respect.
Correct.
Offers him a drink, a cigar. Although Marlowe has invaded his ship without permission, he's come up through some.
It's similar to Nick Carraway's first meeting with Jay Gatsby. The way he treats him.
That's a comparison, sure. But I think that's also it's similar to Eddie Mars from The Big Sleep too. I mean, Eddie Mars is also described as
Yeah.
someone who is not without a certain charisma and not without and someone that you give a grudging respect to somehow. And yeah, yeah. So that's the interesting contrast. Like, with the cops, with a couple of exceptions that Marlowe's running into, he's getting blackjacked by them, he's getting manhandled by them, he's getting lied to by them. He's getting the glad hand and then given the bum's rush. But with Laird Brunette, there's sort of a mutual respect between this mobster and this gumshoe. Not both not part of conventional society, both on the outskirts of potential society, but they kind of meet there, and there's a sort of a little respect you can sense between the two, and that's why, and you get that throughout the novels, that how whenever there's a mobster involved, not all the time, but it seems to me, as a general statement, that the mobsters come off better than the cops. And so I find Laird Brunette to be actually, for my money, the most interesting, as you say, Gatsby-esque, intriguing character, because we see so little of him, but what we see of him is very incisive, and it's a very it's a turning point. And he does get the message to Moose Malloy. He does do the job. He is a man of honor. He gets that message to Moose Malloy, and Moose Malloy shows up. And now we can take the people to the end of the story. Moose Malloy is like the only person, it seems, at this point who doesn't know that Velma Valento is Mrs. Lewin Lockridge Grayle, right? Marlowe obviously knows it. There are other people who have a very strong hunch. Some people know it precisely. Some are dead, like Mrs. Jessie Florian and Lindsay Marriott. But Moose is the only one. So Marlowe, because they've had there's a wonderful scene where they're drinking scotch and they're trying to, Mrs. Grayle's trying to seduce Marlowe, and they have a little kissing scene, and so there's a little thing between them, and throughout the book, and he invites her by his apartment toward the end of the book now, to pick him up, and they'll go out, for a drink. Well, she comes, and he invites her. He invites her in. In the meantime, however, Moose Malloy has showed up, and we don't know what those 5 words were on the little message, because that's what Marlowe says. There were he wrote 5 words on a piece of paper and gave it to Laird Brunette on the gambling ship. We don't know what those 5 words are, but we can pretty well figure it out pretty soon, because Moose shows up. They start talking. Marlowe says, "I got a date. Hey, hide behind the curtains there, or whatever. Hide in the closet." Mrs. Lewin Lockridge Grayle comes in. They have a drink. They start talking, and then Marlowe then starts leveling her with what he knows, and it's coming out in conversation. We know the whole time Moose is listening, and it's very clear at this point that this is Velma Valento. And Moose comes out, and he goes, "Velma, I thought it was you, just by the sound of your voice." And you can tell this poor lug, he's still in love with her, He's still in love with this woman, despite all she's done to him, and particularly trying to avoid him. And at a certain point, she shoots him, and shoots him 5 shots from her gun. There's a great line, I have it in mind. Chandler describes it. She shot him 5 times in the stomach. They went in soundlessly, like 5 fingers into a glove. And she tries to kill Marlowe, but she's got no shot left, and she runs off, and Marlowe lets her run off. And eventually she's discovered on the East Coast, and some cop discovered her. They put her out on the wire. He recognized her face, and she kills him too, and then she shoots herself in the heart. And that's the end of the story. So a lot of dead bodies, and a lot of intrigue, and
the irony of her turning the gun on herself is she probably would have gotten off in the trial, according to the narrative.
Right.
She had enough connections, and she had shot herself seemingly in self-defense because
Moose had a gun. Moose had a
that's
gun in his
right.
hand.
That's right.
Yeah. Right.
And so, what a waste. She to just kill herself when she could have gotten off is what's mentioned in the book.
Right. And Marlowe speculates. He says, well, she was no angel, but maybe in those last final moments she felt that she could do something for the one man who'd ever done anything of real meaning for her, that she wouldn't come back for trial and humiliate her husband, Mr. Lewin Lockwood's Grail.
Oh,
and then right, remember that line? And then
yeah.
and then Randall says, "Oh, that's silly. She killed a cop. She killed a cop along the way. What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, it sounded silly." Marlowe says, "Well, it sounded silly as soon as I said it. I guess you're right. Forget it." But he throws that out there, like a little romantic touch. You never know. That's classic Chandler. Throw a little romantic tinge in there just to unsettle you.
Kevin, out of all these very colorful characters that you've mentioned, you forgot one very colorful character. The pink bug.
Yeah. Yeah, the pink bug. There's a good line about that. I actually got the pink bug, folks, is this bug. He's sitting is it Randall's office again?
In the homicide department office.
Right. There's a good line there. It's what is it? It's going to take me forever to find it. I got it. A shiny black bug with a pink head and pink spots on it crawled slowly along the polished top of Randall's desk and waved a couple of feelers around as if testing the breeze for a takeoff. It wobbled a little as it crawled, like an old woman carrying too many parcels. Yeah. Well, something on that note, I just wanted I collected a few of these similes just in rapid fire. I just want to throw a few at the folks here, okay, because this is what I find in large part extremely entertaining about these Marlowe novels. Here's one where Malloy walks into the Negro bar. There was a sudden silence as heavy as a waterlogged boat. If that doesn't convey it.
There you go.
And here's one with Nolte. Nolte, the bum cop, can't solve any case. His smile was as cunning as a broken mousetrap.
Oh, wow.
Little kooky, but yeah, you get the message. And here's where he goes into Mrs. Florian's house. The broken down drunk. Uh-huh. The voice dragged itself out of her throat like a sick man getting out of bed. Right. And here's a great description. And all these descriptions of the rooms, as our mother said, are very vivid, of course, but they also fit the character. They always fit the character. And here's one for poor Mr. Lindsay Marriott, who's sort of an aesthete type, sort of an effete aesthete type. And Marlowe describes going into his living room. We went down 3 steps to the main part of the living room. The carpet almost tickled my ankles. There was a concert grand piano closed down. On one corner of it stood a tall silver vase on a strip of peach-colored velvet, and a single yellow rose in the vase. There's plenty of nice soft furniture, a great many floor cushions, some with golden tassels and some just naked. It was a nice room, if you didn't get rough. There was a wide damask-covered divan in a shadowy corner, like a casting couch. It was the kind of room where people sit with their feet in their laps and sip absinthe through lumps of sugar and talk with high, affected voices and sometimes just squeak. It was a room where anything could happen except work. Anyway, and that's where
I
Mr.
like that one. Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Marriott lives. And then here's Marlowe after he gets blackjacked in Parissima Canyon. He wakes up all groggy. I felt like an amputated leg. Yeah, I know that feeling. And then here he describes, yeah.
That's a good one. That's one of the famous similes. I felt like
Yeah,
an amputated.
let's do a few more here. And then there's Anne Reardon, the ex chief of police of Bay City, who, because of the corrupt system,
The
he got
daughter of the ex-chief.
outed, the daughter, and she kind of noses into the case. She likes Marlowe anyway, and she wore a hat with a crown the size of a whiskey glass and a brim you could have wrapped the week's laundry in. That's the audacious thing that I could never think of something like that. It was a nice face. He's talking about Anne Reardon again. It was a nice face, a face you get to like. Pretty, but not so pretty that you would have to wear brass knuckles every time you took it out.
There you go. There you go.
And just a couple more, then I'll leave it to you. And here's where he meets Miss Grail for the first time. The ex Miss Velma Valento, very sexy number. Oh, I hope you can. She gave me a smile I could feel in my hip pocket.
Now that is that a crude reference there, or is that
no? It's just
okay.
like a very penetrating, very you feel it. You feel the smile.
Okay.
You could feel it in your wherever, but he just chose that.
There you go.
And maybe one for the road. Oh yeah, this is where he starts. It's really wild. I mean, they start to make out. He starts to make out Marlowe with Mrs. Grail in her living room. They've had a lot of scotch to drink, and the husband comes in, this older fellow, right? Very ineffectual. He loves his wife, but she kind of ignores him. And Mr. Grail stood up and said he was very glad to have met me and that he would go and lie down for a while. He didn't feel very well. He hoped I would excuse him. He was so polite, I wanted to carry him out of the room just to show my appreciation.
He also talks about how guilty he felt to have cuckolded this man in such a fashion. He has a good line at the end there about how guilty he felt. I felt like... I felt nasty, as if I had picked a poor man's pocket. There you go.
Right. And there's another one when they're drinking the scotch. She poured us some more scotch. It didn't seem to affect her any more than water affects Boulder Dam. It goes on and on. It gives you guys a taste for why I find him so amusing. And here's another one. Here's where the big Indian who eventually, who's one of Jules Amthor's henchmen, and he basically strangles Marlowe within an inch of his life. Later on, the Indian comes to pick him up, and all his clothes are very ill-fitting. And he's got a little hat perched on his head. And Marlowe says he wore it about where a house wears a wind vane. Okay.
Some of these are audacious. I call them audacious similes.
Right. He also describes the Indian. He says he looked as nervous as a brick wall. Guy's very stoic Indian type, and he describes this guy he calls Hemingway. That's another kind of joke, right? He called this guy Hemingway, and he said, "Hey, why are you calling me Hemingway?" He said, "Well, you're a guy who just keeps repeating the same thing until it starts to sound good."
Is that a knock on Ernest?
It's like, well, Chandler loved Hemingway. He was very fond of him, but it's like Hemingway is a very kind of limited vocabulary. And like the Killers, it's similar to that. That one's like the Killers. Every time Marlowe says something, this guy repeats it.
So it's kind of an affectionate little dig.
It's via the Killers, I believe. Where they keep repeating things. Like, oh yeah, he says he wants to get a bite to eat. He's a bright boy. Isn't he a bright boy, Al? Yeah, he's a bright boy, Al. Yeah, he is a bright boy. Yeah. Bright boy. And this Hemingway guy keeps repeating everything Marlowe says. Oh, you think so? You can't. Mr. Jules Amthor. That kind of thing. So I could kind of see it from the Killer's point of view. And he talks about this Hemingway guy. He was the kind of cop who spits on his blackjack every night instead of saying his prayers.
Oh, I love it.
He had a heart as big as one of Mae West's hips.
Oh,
Yeah,
boy.
yeah, and then right. This is the great scene where he's trying to come out from under it in the private hospital, Dr. Zonderborg, where he wakes up and he's just completely wiped out, right? Because he's been shot up with some kind of drugs. And that's a great scene. It's about a 4 or 5 page scene where he's just trying to come out of it,
Okay.
right? And I'll stop there.
Okay, Kev, we have 5 minutes left. Just real quick, I was hoping you would read us the whole passage about the pink bug, not just the opening line or two.
Oh, well, I
Just give us
lost it.
the whole passage.
I lost it. But what I can do is I want to spring this one on you. And we were talking about drinking only recently in the book.
Yeah.
And you did a curse counter last time,
Okay.
a profanity counter. I did the drink counter. I did the drinkometer here. I went through this because I read it enough. I was having fun with it this time.
Yeah.
I was noting every drink and when he took it. And the thing is, Marlowe the guy's sloshing with booze all day and night. He's full of it. Here, I give it to you. Listen, folks. This is an all-time first, I think, in analyses of Farewell, My Lovely. I dare say. Our drinkometer.
Kev,
yeah.
But we only have 4 minutes, so get it all in there.
That's a good caveat because you know how much Marlowe drinks in this novel. Good.
Yeah.
Day 1, 2 whiskey sours, which he drinks with Moose Malloy, 2 bourbons, 2 drinks from the office bottle. He's got a bottle in his office. I believe it's whiskey, so that could be a shorthand for whiskey. 1 brandy at least. We can't quite tell if it's more than 1. Then at night, the next day, he says, I banged myself to sleep with a bottle. Well, so let's say not the whole bottle, but maybe a half a bottle and probably of whiskey. That seems to be his drink. That's day 1. Day 2, 2 drinks from the office bottle. So 2 more drinks of whiskey. Then he goes to Mrs. Grayle's, Velma Valento. 6 to 8 scotch and sodas with Mrs. Grayle. I couldn't quite tell from the prose whether it was 6 or 8, but it's 6 to 8, okay?
Okay.
Day 3, this is when he gets blackjacked. He's out. He's been pumped full of drugs. He's with Dr. Zonderborg. Most of day 4, he's also drugged. He wakes up. The first thing he sees is a bottle of whiskey there on the table. He takes a drink, and it's doctored to make him throw up. That's why he throws harder than Dizzy Dean, okay? He goes into the Dr. Zonderberg's office. It's still before midnight on day 4, and he asks Dr. Zonderberg to pour him a whiskey or 2, and they have 2. He has 2. Dr. Zonderberg has 2. And then he goes off to have another drink with Ann Reardon. We don't know what kind of drink. He has a brandy in his coffee with Miss Reardon. He has 2 somethings. We don't know what it is exactly out of a nice crystal glass. Day 5, he has 3 unspecified drinks with the Bay City Chief of Police, Wax, probably whiskey. He has 1 dry martini before he takes off on the water taxi to Laird Brunette's gambling boat. There, he drinks 2 scotches with Laird Brunette. He has 1 unspecified drink later on. Next day, talking to Ann Reardon, he has 2 more drinks. And the final tally, the grand total, over 6 days, with 2 days out on his back in the hospital, 1 dry martini, 2 whiskey sours, 2 bourbons, 2 brandies, 8 to 10 scotches, 7 whiskeys, plus 1/2 to a full bottle of whiskey. Call it 7. This is the one where he knocked himself out with a bottle of whiskey all night. Call it 7 for an even 14 whiskeys, 9 undefined drinks, most likely whiskey or scotch, and no beer or wine, just the hard stuff for Mr. Philip Marlowe. And now that on top of being blackjacked twice, being beat up with his own gun, being strangled half to death by a giant Indian, and a few more little encounters that, we don't even need to mention. So that's enough. So how do you like that?
That was a very special feature you've added to our discussion. the Kevin Drinkometer.
And that isn't even counting the stuff that Chandler doesn't mention, that Marlowe doesn't deem it even necessary to mention. So
okay, Kevin. Well, that's a great way to conclude and wrap up our discussion of Farewell, My Lovely. One last question I had before we finish. Where does he get the title Farewell, My Lovely? Who is the lovely that he's saying farewell to? Or is that just a generic title?
Well, I keep my Wikipedia page open for just these moments. It seems that the title came from the title of the novel is apparently a reference to a song in the 1935 musical review At Home Abroad. And it's a review with music by Arthur Schwartz and lyrics by Howard Dietz. And yeah, it was a Broadway production. Ran for 198 performances with Eleanor Powell, the inimitable, Eddie Foy Jr., among others. And the review was produced by the Schuberts and directed by Vincent Minnelli and Thomas Mitchell. So I guess he got it from that. So Mr. Chandler had an ear for popular music as well.
Okay, very good, Kevin. So thank you very much. And next week, I believe we're going to be doing The High Window. Is that not correct?
That's right. And that's an amazingly great novel for one that no one ever mentions. How's that for a
Okay.
intro?
All right, Kevin. Thanks a
All right.
lot. We'll see you next week.
Farewell, my brother.
Okay.